August 9th, 2005, Singapore's 40th birthday. The men who steered the country through its early years and into middle age are guests of honor at the National Day Parade. But what sort of country have they created? A tiny island with no natural resources, it's now one of the wealthiest states in Asia. What's been the secret of its success? How did a volatile third world backwater become a stable first world power? Others have tried to make the same journey and failed. What was so special about Singapore? The country's peculiar mix of economic ambition and political control has produced 40 years of almost unbroken wealth. But can the same formula keep delivering? Is Singapore ready to meet the demands of the 21st century? Today, the skyline of downtown Singapore is evidence of a wealthy, stable country. 40 years ago, it was barely a country at all.
Singapore has broken away from the Malaysian Federation and become independent. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's Prime Minister, wept when he announced the split.
For me, it is a moment of anguish because all my life.
To Lee Kuan Yew, independence came as a shock.
Let's get together.
Only 2 years before, he'd led Singapore out of the British Empire
Malaysia forever.
and into the federal state of Malaysia.
Million strong.
But any hope of a bright future together collapsed as Malays and Chinese turned on each other. Malaysia's leader, Tunku Abdul Rahman, ejected Singapore from the Federation.
And so we decided that we must part company.
Singaporeans thought their city-state was too small and vulnerable to be fully independent. The opening of their first parliament in December '65 did little to allay their fears.
The Malaysian brigadier who was in charge of the brigade here, he said, "Sir, I've been given orders to escort you from your office to Parliament." I did a quick think. I said, oh, this is the Tunku demonstrating to the world that our independence is by his leave and license. So I said, yes, thank you very much. I thought, oh, I don't have a single soldier that will respond to my orders. My soldiers were then under his control. It was going to happen again and again until we are able to say, no, you don't. I don't need this, thank you very much.
Defense became the #1 priority for the new Singaporean state. But who would be prepared to give them military help? Israel, like Singapore, was a small country surrounded by larger Muslim neighbors, and its army had a fearsome reputation. At the time, it had very few allies in the developing world, so was keen to offer the hand of friendship to Singapore. In 1966, Singapore created a citizens' militia army based on the Israeli model. The entire male population did national service and received military training, so they could then be called up in a time of crisis.
It was the first act of independence. The first thing that you do is to pick up the gun, and therefore to be a master of your own destiny. There's always a sense that unless we are strong, unless we are alert, the conditions of our existence are precarious.
Faster, jump over! Good! And keep your head down! Keep your head down!
Today, the military threat is greatly reduced, but national service is still compulsory. Army training has a powerful symbolic role, reinforcing a sense of nationhood.
Go all the way! Come on!
National service is a very equalizing experience. You bring people from all strata of society, and then you train them together. They live together in barracks, and by force of circumstance, they have to learn to live with each other. And to understand that there are others in Singapore who look differently, who worship differently, who speak differently. Singapore is our home. It's not an invention, it is a real thing, you know. I mean, it's 660 square kilometers of land in which we all live. We have nowhere else to go. That's our home.
Every year at the National Day Parade, the link between the army and the nation still takes pride of place. But a militarily strong state would count for nothing unless built on a strong economy. How did Singapore become an Asian tiger? Independence was an economic disaster for Singapore. For 100 years, its economy had been intertwined with that of Malaya. Industrial commodities like rubber and tin were produced on the Malayan mainland and then transported to Singapore to be traded around the world. But in 1965, the link with Malaya was cut, and Singapore was on its own. It had no industries, very few factories, and a growing unemployment problem. To make matters worse, the British were planning to pull out all the troops they still had on the island and close their military base, which was the largest employer in Singapore and generated a sixth of the country's wealth.
Some 50,000 direct employees will be out of jobs. And if you take the multiplier, you know, the British forces here buying goods from the provision shops and dry cleaners, bars, hiring maids, etc. We were in a pickle. Lo and behold, we were helped by the Chinese Cultural Revolution.
As so often in Singapore's history, events beyond its shores played a decisive role. The outburst of revolutionary fever in China scared off Western companies from investing in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Instead, they turned to Singapore. In the late 60s, the first Western electronics companies set up basic assembly lines in Singapore. In the 70s, they were producing circuit boards and silicon chips. By the 80s, Singapore was one of the leading centers in Asia for the production of consumer electronics.
Everybody treat multinationals as evil companies. Singapore was only one who said, no, we welcome you. They come here, they set up their factory, they run full freedom, no interference, 100% ownership. So I used to tell my colleagues, we are in the hospitality business.
Foreign companies were lured by the prospect of low taxes, cheap wages, and a well-trained workforce.
Punctuality, take your work seriously, produce a good product. All these are value systems that you got to inculcate into the young people. We don't train people to be Greek mythologists, English literature, ancient literature. No, everything is engineering, science, technical skill. And skill set that can earn a living.
foreign companies were also attracted by Singapore's approach to industrial relations. In 1968, new labor laws greatly restricted the right to strike.
If you had strikes, go-slows, we would actively encourage employers to sack the lot. And after 3 or 6 months, we restart with a new workforce, carefully screened so no troublemaker is in that re-employed group. At the end of the day, we're all so many digits in a machine. The point is, are these digits stronger digits than the competitors' digits?
Singapore's ability to attract foreign investors continues to this day. It is still the Asian base for dozens of multinational companies. But Lee Kuan Yew always wanted Singapore to be more than just a haven for foreign capital. He wanted people to learn from the multinationals and create Singaporean companies to compete on the international market. But who could set up such companies? Lee believed that in tiny Singapore, there weren't the people with the money or vision to run large corporations. So he created them. A team of gifted civil servants were given a crash course in business skills and then put in charge of new companies set up by the government. One of the first and most high-profile ventures was Singapore Airlines. In 1972, it seemed an unlikely idea that a small island with no domestic market could have an international airline. And while the government was willing to invest in the project, it made it clear from the start the new company would be run on strictly commercial lines.
We had an inaugural dinner in which I spelled out the terms on which Singapore Airlines must operate.
He said, we are not running Singapore Airlines as a prestige organization for the government. So if you don't make money, I will close you down without hesitation.
This is not a government that is willing or able to support a flag carrier for the sake of a flag carrier.
Knowing him, we all know that he will do what he said. So that was really a great incentive for us to make Singapore Airlines profitable right from the beginning.
At the time, the aviation industry was highly regulated, but Singapore Airlines refused to play by the rules set down by its governing body, IATA.
They control the meals, the drinks, the earphones. They even specify how thick the sandwiches that the airlines can serve to the passengers. I mean, it went to those ridiculous extent. So resign from IATA. We give free drinks. We don't charge for earphones. And that went down very well with the passengers.
In-flight service was the battleground on which Singapore Airlines competed with other carriers. And still today, it is a huge catering operation. It produces 65,000 meals a day for its own flights and those of many other airlines.
When you serve the passengers, what's the first thing you need to do?
Greet them.
Greet them. All at one go? Would that be better?
Yes.
Okay.
But its most prized asset has always been its cabin crew.
Would you like to have a glass?
They spend more time in training than at any other major airline.
That's right. Okay. Make small talk if it's appropriate. Okay? All right, let's start.
Good morning, ma'am. May I offer you a drink? Orange juice, wine, and beer. Which one do you prefer?
Apple juice, please.
Here you go, your apple
Thank
juice.
you very much.
Good morning, ma'am. Would you like to have a glass?
When our girls provide good service, they look as if they are doing this naturally.
Here is your orange juice.
Actually, they are doing this according to very strict procedures.
Okay, these are the 4 juices you're going to offer her, right?
Okay.
See how it goes. Try.
Okay, come on.
They have Asian background, so they give the Asian way of courtesy. But at the same time, they are educated in the English language.
Ask is not available on.
So they are able to converse, they are able to solve problems.
Maybe you would like to try a fresh squeeze of orange juice.
And it's this combination of the Asian and Western culture in the Singapore population that is so important.
In the 70s, the stewardesses became the stars of a global marketing campaign.
Her home is 5 miles high.
You know the Singapore Airlines advertisement, slow, with the girl smiling in various locations. It's a fantasy built around the Singapore girl and the romance of travel. And it was an instant success because it was so different that people were glued to their TV.
The Singapore Girl has become one of the most widely recognized brands in Asia, and for many, a symbol of Singapore itself, a mix of Western efficiency and Eastern promise.
You're a great way to fly.
The Singapore Girl was the idea of some advertising agency. I had nothing to do with it. It was a success, so I congratulated the management for having such an agency.
Show me half the world and more. Show me all those places.
But at the same time, that was quite a problem because for the Singapore Girl to remain attractive, she's got to stay on the right side of the 30s.
Follow the triangle.
And if you allow the kind of trade union rules to keep a matron on till she's 40, then you haven't quite got that bloom of youth and freshness and eagerness, and that was quite a problem. So very early on we made quite sure that everybody understood we play by a different set of rules.
The airline's success with in-flight service was extended to its growing fleet of aircraft. Its planes are younger and renewed quicker than at any other major airline.
We roll over 10 747s at one time. So we were buying maybe 10 plus 10 options, and we were replacing maybe 10 747s in one go. Now that was unheard of. People thought we were crazy.
Today, Singapore Airlines is one of the most successful carriers in the world. But the company is still largely state-owned. The same is true of Changi Airport. Efficient and profitable, it complements the airline. And Singapore's huge container port, one of the most modern in the world, is run by the PSA, a government organization. In almost every sector, telecoms, manufacturing, heavy industry, state-owned companies dominate. There's been some privatization in recent years, but a significant portion of the domestic economy is still at least partly controlled by the state.
Yes, we can. Together we can do much more. We'll do it.
By and large, the Singaporean model has been seen by many as a form of successful socialism.
We have a plan. We have a plan.
But in Singapore, socialism has been tempered by hard-nosed economics.
Yes, we can. Together
The bottom line has always been productivity.
To be a good socialist, you must make money. Because most people say, oh, that's rob everybody, get socialism. That's what happens in most countries. Rob the rich, give to the poor. First, you have to have people who are rich enough to spread their wealth. You don't want a society where people have what I have for handouts. There's no handout here. It is socialism, but in a different form.
Singapore's style of socialism has been most evident in its approach to housing. The leaders of the country were heavily influenced by the British welfare state, and its ability to clear slums and provide modern, affordable homes. They wanted the same for Singapore.
The families, which had once lived in slums, now had private entrances, glass windows, piped water, gas, and electricity.
The government embarked on a massive public building program, creating huge estates across the island, rehousing the vast majority of the population. But there was always a fundamental difference between the Singaporean and British approach. Instead of renting out apartments, people were encouraged to buy them. Lee Kuan Yew wanted to avoid the sort of dependency culture he had seen emerging in Britain.
We started selling a few blocks. I said, this is yours. You pay it by installment over 20 years. And we could see the stark difference between an owner-occupied high-rise and a rented high-rise. One was cared after, looked after, precious because it's theirs. The other just declines. So we decided that we'll give everybody a chance to own their own home.
Ironically, this approach to social housing would eventually find its way back to Britain when Margaret Thatcher came to power. She'd been a long-time admirer of Lee Kuan Yew and, inspired by the Singaporean model, encouraged tenants to buy their own homes. Few people in Britain realized the policy had been copied from Singapore. Today, 80% of Singapore's population live in apartments built by the state but owned privately. New satellite towns have been created. The landscape of the island has been transformed. Cherian George is a writer who has chronicled the changes in Singapore. The road where he used to live no longer exists. It's been bulldozed to make way for a new overpass.
So I'm guessing that our front door would have been around here. My living room. Welcome. It's the first time I've been back since 20 years, I guess. Yeah. I mean, it's sad that I can't point to a place and say that, well, yes, this is where I grew up, because it's gone. But it's nothing different from what most Singaporeans go through. The memory of Singaporeans' childhoods is something that tends to be sacrificed in this, in the name of progress. It's hard to feel settled when things are moving so fast.
For decades, Singaporeans have enjoyed almost unbroken economic success. But the price of that success has been their compliance. They've had to accept whatever changes the government has deemed necessary. But at some point, the first notes of dissent would be heard. On the 31st of October 1981, something extraordinary happened in the Anson district of Singapore. The People's Action Party that had governed the country since independence lost a by-election.
I was the organizing secretary, and I did tell Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew that we will lose many votes. So he asked me, would we lose? I said no, but we lost.
The winner of the election was J.B. Jeyaretnam, a lawyer turned politician and leader of the Workers' Party.
It was a night that, has to be lived to remember. And I lived that night. It was wonderful. The crowd just went wild. There was a great feeling of, well, perhaps things are going to change.
Jeyaretnam was seen as a champion by the poorest in Singapore, those who had benefited least from the economic miracle. And now, he was the first ever opposition member of parliament. For 16 years, every seat had been held by the PAP.
I was a bit intimidated. But one gets used to it, one gets into the fight. And I've chosen to go into the fight. So you get braver. I was referred no less than 6 times for unprofessional conduct. And they said that was a record.
We regarded him as rather destructive. Destructive in the sense that his views, were there to catch hold, would have destroyed Singapore. He was actually more for welfare, which you are dead against. You offer welfare to the people, we think over 2 elections, the place will be destroyed.
In 1984, general elections were held across the island. Jeyaretnam stood again in Anson, and again he won a spectacular victory.
The PAP were confident that they would recapture Anson. And I was returned from that constituency with an increased majority.
Well, I'd like to speak to the voters of Anson. My dear, dear voters of Anson, you've made it again. You have withstood the onslaught of the mighty PAP.
We're not going to give up that easily to anybody who challenge our rule. So we therefore take opposition very seriously. So when you lose one seat, there's great consternation.
Jeyaretnam would not remain in Parliament for long. In 1986, he was prosecuted over a false declaration of accounts by his Workers' Party. He was fined and sentenced to a month in Queenstown Prison.
The prison officers were embarrassed. They knew about me, but I didn't get any preferential treatment. It was grim.
Jeyaretnam had to give up his seat in Parliament and was disqualified from acting as an attorney. But Singapore was a Commonwealth country, and he was able to appeal against his disqualification to the law lords of the Privy Council in London. In 1988, they upheld his appeal and reinstated him as an attorney, claiming he had suffered a grievous injustice. But his criminal conviction remained.
I came back and asked the president to remove my convictions. And what was his reply? You have shown no remorse, no penitence. I hadn't admitted that I had committed offenses, and so I can't be pardoned. Privy Council said I had not done anything wrong.
Eventually, Jeyaretnam did return briefly to Parliament, but his career was dogged by a series of complex lawsuits brought against him by the leaders of the PAP.
The hatchet man of Singapore.
These days, he fights not from parliamentary benches, but from shopping centres, selling books that chastise the government, and in particular, the man who has twice successfully sued him for libel, Lee Kuan Yew.
I have told him that unlike other leaders, I carry my own hatchet.
The hatchet man of Singapore.
If he does things which are out of bounds, which are improper, I will pin him down, as I have.
It's hardly the language one would expect from a Democrat. It's the language one would expect from a demagogue.
He doesn't just defame me, he's defamed almost every other minister. And today he's a bankrupt.
I've paid well over $1.5 million, Singapore dollars, in damages and costs for libel suits brought against me.
Although he is now 80, Jeyaretnam still hopes to clear his debts and one day make a political comeback. Lee Kuan Yew has no such ambitions. In 1990, he retired as Prime Minister. And the mantle of power passed seamlessly to his successor, PAP loyalist Goh Chok Tong.
My own mission when I took over was, how do I keep Singapore going? I'm not Lee Kuan Yew. I can't govern like him. I did not fight for independence. I took over Singapore, in a sense, with everything in good working order. But obviously the style of government must change.
Goh Chok Tong promised a kinder, gentler society and a more open political culture. Opposition politicians became a more familiar sight. There were more political parties, more debate. But the floodgates never opened. Elsewhere in Asia, long-standing governments were toppled by a wave of popular feeling. But in Singapore, support for the PAP never dropped below 60%. As long as it has kept delivering economic success, most of the people have kept voting for it.
This government has been so long in power. They genuinely believe they are the best government for Singapore now and in perpetuity. And do you know, I'm almost sure that they want to be a permanent government, not for self-glory, but for the good of the country. So you have this kind of situation that some of us who like a little bit of noise, mess, a little bit of even unruliness, might describe as antiseptic clinical.
The challenge for Singapore always is how do you maintain stability? Because if you lose stability in Singapore, you lose everything. I try to explain it to my friends with a very simple analogy. I say that if you live in America, it's like sailing across the ocean in an aircraft carrier. You can jump up and down, the aircraft carrier is not going to shake. But when you live in Singapore, it's like sailing in a sort of small canoe. And if you have one or two people jumping up and down the canoe will sink.
In 1993, Singapore's political system became international news when American teenager Michael Fay was convicted of vandalism. He received a hefty fine and was sentenced to 4 months in Queenstown prison. And while there, he was to be given 6 lashes of the cane.
Michael Fay is to be tied to a trestle and punished with a rattan cane. Each stroke splits the skin. After 3, victims may go into shock. His crime was to spray paint 18 cars and steal some road signs.
He is going to bleed considerably and may have permanent scars, and I think it is a mistake.
Why should there be a law for the Americans and a different law for Singaporeans? So I thought the Americans believe in the rule of law. Obviously, when an American was to be punished under a foreign law, the Americans were unhappy.
Despite intense lobbying from the US government, Michael Fay was caned on the 5th of May 1994. The only concession the Singaporeans made was to reduce the number of strokes from 6 to 4.
Some Asian diplomats said to me, gee, you know, if we had caught an American and the American ambassador had come to us and said, you know, let go of him, we would have quietly let him go. We wouldn't have put him in jail. You not only put him in jail, you caned him. So it was a way of actually demonstrating, in a sense, how fiercely independent Singapore was.
I myself had difficulty in making an appointment to see President Clinton in the first, I think, first 2 years or so. The White House aide did not put the request on Singapore up to the president. so we just got to accept it. But in the longer term, it was good for us that Singapore was prepared to stand up against mighty America.
A spicy mix of Oriental contradictions, whose rulers worry.
The world's media were fascinated by a country that seemed so Western on the surface, but had such a different approach to social control.
In this super clean Asian city, there's even a ban on chewing gum.
Chewing gum is banned. There's an offence of picking flowers in a public park and a heavy fine if you're caught. And if you use a public lavatory and don't flush it afterwards, you could get nabbed by undercover environmental health officers.
Foreigners may object, some may laugh at us, but not too long ago, many Western societies would have done what we do. It's just that it's now gone, doing these things have gone out of favor in Western society. We are a conservative people, almost Victorian in some of our values. And I believe that on caning, if we were to put it to a referendum, on chewing gum, if we were to put that to a referendum, you will find that the overwhelming majority of Singaporeans will support these policies.
Western critics were dismayed that Singaporeans seemed so docile and willing to accept the rule of their leaders.
They've experienced the most dramatic increase in standard of living that any people have experienced, probably ever since the beginning of man. And then you ask these people, why aren't you revolting? Why aren't you going out on the streets? Well, why should they?
Singapore may have stood firm over the Michael Fay case, but in the years since, it's made a conscious attempt to soften its image. Its government is acutely aware that to keep attracting foreign investors, the city needs to be more appealing, more fun. In recent years, Singapore has been marketed as a city of the arts, good food and nightlife. Some of its straight-laced Victorian values have given way to a more vibrant, lively culture.
The government wants to open up, it wants to change. They are allowing a whole lot of things that, in fact, are astonishing to me. You know, I've observed the scene and said, oh, the government allows bar-top dancing. But it's in the political domain that they remain adamant and a little bit squeamish about opening up, because I suspect this is one area that will challenge their entrenched position. The risks are greater there.
In the year 2000, Singapore's government responded to its critics by creating a speaker's corner as a haven for free speech. But it was to be freedom with conditions. Speakers had to be registered in advance, and certain subjects were off limits.
Initially, if people were curious, it's a new idea. But after 1 week, they found that the speakers were not coming up with any good ideas. It's just the same criticism of the government.
We are a democratic society. We want to see something like America, open society, accountability, transparency, isn't it? Why are you scared?
Today, Speaker's Corner is rarely used, and generates little enthusiasm in the population.
A one-man crusade. A one-man show. One man fighting a regime.
Well, to me, it's very successful because very few people go there to speak.
Once I described it as a kind of uneasy dance, between the government and the people. We allow you 3 steps forward, but hey, wait a minute. If you're not behaving and you're not complying, we pull you back 2 steps. I suppose incrementally there will be an increase in the end, but for a whole lot of Singaporeans, too slowly.
As Singapore celebrates its 40th birthday, it's facing something of a midlife crisis. For 40 years, its success depended on maintaining stability and order at all costs. Now, the country is trying to change, to loosen up. But how far and how fast can it go without destroying the very formula that brought so much success?
City-states don't survive that long. They have flashes of brilliance, 50 years, 100 years, then they go. The eternal challenge for Singapore is how do you ensure that what we've had in this 40 years is not just a brilliant flash and just goes away.
How will Singaporeans cope with the uncertainties of the future? Are they ready for the next 40 years?
Happy birthday, Singapore!
The landscape of Asia is changing, and Singapore is having to change with it. For 40 years, the city-state has been a manufacturing powerhouse, making the most of its efficient, obedient workforce. But with India and China emerging as great industrial powers, Singapore is looking for new ways to make a living.
The greatest danger which Singapore faces today, in my view, is that we have been so successful in the past. And the temptation is always there, that when you have a model which has given you success, you tend to believe that that model will continue forever, and you extrapolate into the future. But the point is that the world has changed.
Singapore's future is now in the hands of unlikely people, like Nixon Fong. He moved to America in the 80s and learned to become a computer animator. Now he's returned and is making Singapore's first big-budget animated movie.
If you're going to be the first one here, you're going to be a pioneer. And I like this kind of challenges. This is a moment.
Fong is regarded by the government as a role model, an entrepreneur setting up a company in a new creative industry, a world away from the factories and assembly lines of old. But he's had great difficulty finding other Singaporeans to work with him in this open, creative way. Nearly all his animators are foreigners from elsewhere in Asia.
But I actually prefer, more detail in the specular. You got to really enjoy working with people, solving problems. How is the government going to groom that? I think, I don't have the answer for that. But, I'm trying to groom people here, like that.
To create more flexible, inquiring minds, the government has targeted the education system for a complete overhaul. It wants young Singaporeans to learn how to think outside the box.
The problem with many of our young people, they are so busy about facts. Because our education system excels on grades. Grades are important, but they must read beyond the textbook. They must see beyond the scene in the movie.
The government is gambling on the future with high stakes. It's invested $500 million Singapore dollars creating Biopolis, an elaborate new center for biotechnology. This is just the sort of high-tech industry it wants to encourage. Again, most of the staff here are foreigners, but the idea is that the next generation of Singaporeans will become familiar with this way of working. And Singapore will be able to rely less simply on hard work and more on the ingenuity of its people.
The new economy is about ideas. It's a more treacherous field for the government to embark in because the path ahead is not as clear.
Ironically, the new future Singapore faces is not so different from the world into which it was born. In the 19th century, it was a small island on the trade route between India and China, having to survive on its wits. In the 21st century, it faces exactly the same challenge again.
We had a period when the big countries withdrew into themselves, and now a reopening up and a re-efflorescence. And suddenly, what we were created to do, we are now able to do again. It's almost like a return to the past.